Hi there, everybody. Welcome to the next chapter in Under Wildwood by Colin Meloy. I first wanted to kind of go over who our characters are and where they are right now. So right now, we've just finished chapter 6, and we learned a lot about Mr. Wigman and about Curtis's sisters, Rachel and Elsie, and a little bit about Desdemona Moodrock. So I just made this little table to kind of help us keep track of our characters and where they are. So right now, Prue, Curtis, and Brendan the Bandit King are on their way to Wildwood from St. John's in Oregon, where Brendan and Curtis saved Prue from the assassin who was her teacher, disguised. We also have Curtis's sisters, Rachel and Elsie, and they are at the Joffrey Unthank Home for Wayward Youth and Machine Parts, which is in the industrial wastes. I have a map here I can pull up and show you. Here is the industrial wastes, right next to the impassable wilderness, right on the Willamette River. And up here in the north, it looks like, north, is Machine Parts. There's the Unthank Home. I imagine it's that one right there. Here is nuclear. That's another one of the titans of industry. Petrochemical. Here's the Wigman Plaza. That's where I assume Wigman is. Shipping and mining. All of the industrial wastes. What Wigman calls the industrial wonders. Here in our map of Wildwood, you can kind of see like Prue's house is over here. Here's the Willamette River, and here are the industrial wastes right there. So this is kind of like a zoomed in version. And then right there, the impassable wilderness, what Joffrey Unthank thinks the impassable wilderness is. It's actually Wildwood, right there. So, pretty exciting. I included a picture of what Mr. Wigman looks like in the book, and I'll be adding to this organizer as we keep reading. But here we go, chapter 7. Chapter 7, Return to Wildwood. Prue was still in shock by the time the heron wove through the deep, snow-shrouded canopy of the trees and touched down on the forest floor. She'd barely uttered 5 words to Curtis, whose midsection she'd hugged tightly during the flight. They'd flown high enough to break through the low-hanging clouds, and she'd been awed to see the pinpricks of stars shining through the darkness of the night sky. But her heart was frozen. The attack had left her numbed, and her mind was spinning with unanswered questions. Why had she been targeted? Who was Miss Dennis after all? And more important, how was she ever going to explain another disappearance to her parents? The heron's breathing was labored as its 2 riders dismounted. Curtis turned to Prue and thrust out his hand. "Hey, partner," he said. It was the first time Prue had been able to smile since the scuffle in the street. She and Curtis shared a handshake that collapsed into a long hug. Pulling apart, Prue searched her friend's eyes. "What's going on, Curtis?" The other heron had deposited Brendan near them. They were standing in a snowy glade, surrounded by tall fir trees. A little moonlight was peering through the shifting clouds, dappling the white snow opalescent. The Bandit King approached Prue and set his hand on her shoulder. His red beard was flecked with frost. "For your safety," he said, "you've got to stay with us." What was that thing?" Prue asked. "A shapeshifter," explained Curtis. "This is all going to sound totally crazy. It was sent to kill you, Prue." "By who?" Brendan spoke. "We don't know. This is all, we don't know. Important thing is you're kept hidden. We gave that thing a good thrashing, but I don't expect it to stay away long." "But what about Miss Dennis? What happened to her? Curtis and Brendan shared a look. I don't think Miss Dennis really exists, said Curtis. She's a kitsune, a black fox who can take the form of a human. Prue absently massaged the nape of her neck, thinking back on the previous few weeks. Mrs. Estevez's resignation, the sudden arrival of her fresh-faced replacement, Miss Dennis, at the school, the dirt beneath the teacher's fingernails after she'd found Prue on the bluff. In the face of these strange events, why was all Prue could manage. Too much to tell, said Curtis. Let's go somewhere warm. Bidding farewell to the exhausted herons, the three travelers marched beyond the clearing's looming underbrush. Curtis and Prue followed Brendan closely as he wove his way through the dense knot of trees. As they walked, Prue peppered her companions with questions. Your family should be safe, responded Brendan to one of Prue's most urgent queries. We're told that kitsunes, while being vicious, deadly creatures, rarely waver from their mark. She was after you, not your parents or your brother. Prue imagined her mother and father watching the lentil curry simmer on the stove, fretfully eyeing the clock. They'd have guessed her disappearance by now. I'll need to let them know I'm safe, said Prue. It's done, said Curtis, lifting the dangling boughs of a vining maple so that Prue could walk underneath. Owl said he'd take care of it. He promised to send a messenger. Oh, that'll be just great, said Prue, envisioning her mother's surprise to have had a starling alight on her knee and explain to her that her missing daughter was okay. She'd just been abducted by bandits and taken back into the impassable wilderness. But I guess nothing my family isn't kind of accustomed to by now. Exactly, said Curtis. Weirdness abounds in the McKeel family. A massive cedar bridged the gap of a narrow defile in the landscape, and the trio carefully walked across the tree's snowy bark to arrive at the other side. A rushing creek babbled below. So where are we going now? Asked Prue. To the camp, replied Brendan. You'll be safe there. And what then? We wait them out. Curtis jumped in. Maybe you could get in on some bandit training. Brendan grumbled. It mayn't be safe for her to venture past the boundary of the camp. In fact, it might not be safe for any of us. Right, said Curtis. That was another thing the wolf said, that the kitsunes might be targeting all the important in the, what do you call it, bicycle coup? The bicycle coup? Asked Prue, nonplussed. Yeah, you missed that bit, the naming, said Curtis. That's what they called the overthrow of all the Southwood government when, after the plinth, we freed the birds and got Lars Svick out of the mansion. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I guess a lot of people are really attached to the whole thing. The bicycle and all. They call you the bicycle maiden, apparently. The bicycle maiden? Prue repeated quietly, trying out the words. The label seemed pretty appealing, actually. Suddenly, a thought occurred to her. Wait a second. If these shapeshifters are after people who were part of the coup, what about Iphigenia and Owl? Won't they be targeted too? Aye, perhaps, said Brendan. We don't know the details of these assassins or their masters' intents. We don't really know if there's more than just the one. Maybe they're after everyone. Maybe they're just after you. In any case, we've been tasked to keep you safe, Prue, since there weren't nothing to guard you in the outside. They filed in a single-file line. They walked in a single-file line along a game trail that seemed to Prue indistinguishable from the wild forest floor. Curtis told her everything the wolf, Corporal Donalbain, had reported at the clandestine meeting in Northwood. The patriotism surrounding the coup, the rise of the Snod, The marginalization of the interim government, the deprivations brought on by the unrest and the harsh winter, it was enough to make Prue's head spin. "I can't believe how much has changed in only a few short months," exclaimed Prue as they skirted the boundary of a grassy meadow. "I mean, what happened? They're getting it all wrong." She abruptly stopped and planted her hands on her hips. "Why don't we just go down there? I mean, I'm the bicycle maiden after all. Can't we just go march into Southwood to the mansion and just get things going again?" "Not safe, Prue," said Brendan. "Our instructions are to keep you away from the watching eyes of whoever is trying to have you done in. Come on, let's keep moving. We're nearly there." Within 15 paces, they arrived at a dense tangle of high salal bushes, which created something of a wall that seemed to extend in either direction endlessly. Brendan paused and studied it. "This is fairly new," he explained, "still getting used to where... Aha! Tucked inconspicuously within the hedge's greenery was a web-like piece of fabric that Brendan pulled aside to reveal a passageway. Prue walked in first and ducked low to avoid the low-hanging tendrils of leaves that batted at her hair. Clearing the massive hedgerow, she suddenly felt the ground slip away beneath her. She yelped and scrambled backward. The moon had disappeared behind a cloud, and the ground before her was veiled in blackness. Brendan appeared, carrying a lit torch. "Careful there," he cautioned. "Watch your feet." The Bandit King swept the torch out before them, and Prue saw that she was standing at the edge of a rocky cliff. "Where are we?" she exclaimed. "The Long Gap," said Brendan. "Our new home." Handing the torch to Curtis, he reached behind a nearby rock and produced a large spool of rope that had been hidden there. Giving a quick, shrill whistle, he tossed the rope over the edge where Prue heard it patter against the cliff wall. He then looped an oxbow of the rope through a metal ring attached to his leather belt and tried the strength of the line. It held firm, anchored at the base of a large tree. He gestured to Prue. "Climb on," he said. Prue threw her arms around Brendan's neck and felt her stomach plunge as he began descending, backward, down the cliff face. The rope supported them. He fed it from his gloved hands as he easily walked his way downward. Prue nuzzled her face into his shoulder, her eyes shut tight. The bandit smelled of sweat and evergreen needles. After a time, as the mouth of the giant cleft swallowed the cloudy sky above them, the two rappellers alighted on a wooden platform that was affixed to the cliff wall. A small red lantern provided a dim light. Brendan set Prue down gently and then gave 2 hard tugs to the rope. Prue looked around her, getting her bearings. The bottom of the rocky fissure was still obscured by impenetrable dark. Leading from the platform was a rope bridge, which crossed into the darkness. A few flickering lights could be seen in the distance like a swarm of fireflies. Curtis joined them shortly on the platform. He detached the rope from a figure-8 clasp at his belt. Prue looked at him with amazement. "Where'd you learn to do that?" "Rappelling," he said, smiling. "3rd period." A whistle sounded from across the chasm. Prue could see someone on the other side of the rope bridge swinging a lantern. Brendan whistled twice, quickly, and then the 3 travelers began crossing. The wind whipped through the gorge. The bridge bowed and shivered as they reached their midway point. Prue, her hands fixed tightly to the rope that served as the handrail, concentrated all her powers on not looking down. Arriving at a platform on the far side, they were greeted by a bandit. "Eamon," said Brendan. "King," replied the bandit. Prue now recognized what had been those elusive dancing lights she'd seen from the other side of the bridge. All along the steep, jagged wall, lanterns dotted the cliff face, illuminating deep recesses in the rock where crude structures had been built of knobby tree limbs. Door frames and vestibules covered here and there by deer hide flaps. More rope bridges could now be seen, linking these many cave openings together. Several crisscrossed the gap farther along, while where other lanterns could be seen shining, wooden steps led down deeper into the chasm, and Prue saw that this dizzying constellation of lantern light continued on downward beyond the range of her vision. Having heard their whistle, faces began appearing from within the fissures in the stone. The hardened faces of the bandits could be seen peering down at the newly arrived travelers. "You moved," was all Prue could manage to say. "Yeah," replied Brendan. "We change hideouts when the assembly determines that the camp ain't safe. We'd been compromised by the coyotes. We had no choice but to move." He stood on the platform and proudly surveyed the entire camp, extending out as it did in all directions along the cliff wall. "It was a doozy to set up, but I think we'll be able to stay here a while." Prue looked over the edge, trying to make out the farthest lights and the cave entrances they illuminated. Beyond was total blackness. "How far does it go down?" she asked. "No one knows," said Brendan. "We found some sign of ancient settlers, cliff dwellers, farther below, but the way gets harder beyond that. So don't be dropping anything you might value, 'cause you won't see it come back." A rickety wooden staircase led farther down the face of the wall to what looked to be a launching area of some kind. A long platform that extended out into the chasm, surrounded by a wooden handrail. At one end of the platform, a hole had been routed to allow a gnarled tree that had grown out of the cliff face through the planking. The stout tree anchored a cable that bowed out into the distant dark. Attached to the cable was a wheeled pulley assembly, which in turn supported the weight of a large box, big enough to support 4 or 5 people. Brendan waved the way forward, and Prue gingerly climbed in. "Hold on," instructed Brendan as he and Curtis climbed into the box beside her. Curtis undid a line that was holding the box in place, and the vehicle took off, zipping down the cable past a dazzling array of lantern-lit hovels and cave entrances, platforms, and walkways. The box stopped sharply at a lower platform. As another bandit attendant greeted them, Prue could see beyond to a massive opening in the cliff face, where throngs of colorfully clad bandits gathered around a large fire pit. The smell of cooked venison hovered in the air. As soon as Prue arrived on the stone floor of the cave, everyone's attention immediately swiveled to the new arrival. "Prue!" one said. "The outsider girl," said another. Brendan swiftly allayed their curiosity. "Fellow bandits, please welcome back to the camp our friend and ally, Prue McKeel. We've been asked to give her asylum. Her life is in great danger." There followed a murmur of consent. Prue heard someone mumble something about another mouth to feed, but the voice was quickly shushed. One voice rang out above the rest. "What's the danger?" Brendan addressed the assembled bandits, telling them everything he'd been told. He explained in detail their desperate flight from North Wood, the skirmish on the street in the outside. After the story, a hush fell over the crowd. More bandits had arrived, and Prue could see the dirty faces of young children peering at her from behind their parents' legs. Finally, one bandit stepped forward. He was a younger man, dressed in a kind of ratty sashed coat. Prue didn't recognize him. She guessed that they'd needed to recruit a whole host of new bandits since the war with the governess. "But, Brendan," he asked haltingly, "what if it comes for us?" Another voice chimed in, a woman's voice. "Yeah," she said, "we've only just got settled here. Will we have to move again?" It ain't going to come for us," said Brendan. "It won't even come close. This is the best hidden camp we've had in a generation. I don't expect to leave it till the babies born here are old. But if it makes everyone more at ease, we'll post extra watches, tighten security. Even if a kitsune does get in here, it won't survive the fight. Clear?" A litany of eyes. The Bandit King continued, "To many of you, this may just be another body to feed and clothe. That's a reasonable concern. I know the stores are thin. I know the robin ain't bringing in what it should. But we're a strong band, and we've weathered worse. My great-grandfather Ben survived the bandit wars with his people eating naught but grass and moss tufts, and still come out the victor. We're made of that stock. We can weather this." The crowd talked among themselves. After a time, consensus was reached. Prue could stay. She smiled warmly at the crowd. "Thanks, everyone," she managed, though her voice was hoarse with exhaustion. It had been a very long day. Curtis guessed as much and nudged his friend with his elbow. "Come on," he said. "I'll take you to the trainee barracks." The two friends bid their good nights. They followed a wooden walkway that snaked along the cliff wall away from the common area. Curtis carried a red lantern, lighting the way. Prue studied him as they walked, a dusty halo from the lit wick revealing a Curtis she didn't think she recognized from before. His face looked longer, older. It seemed to her that his shoulders filled out the raggedy uniform he was wearing in a way she hadn't remembered. The left lens of his wire-framed glasses had a hairline crack in it, just at the nose. The eyes behind them seemed somehow more worldly. He noticed her looking. "What's up?" he asked, smiling embarrassedly. "Oh, I don't know," said Prue. "You look changed, is all." "Well, I am a greenhorn bandit, first class." She laughed at the terminology. "Oh, Curtis, who knew this was how you'd end up?" "It's where I belong, Prue. This is my life now." A rope bridge split off from the walkway leading across the gap. They followed it. "What about your parents? Your sisters?" "They're fine. I convinced a migrating crane to do a flyby recently just to see how things are. He sent word that he saw them packing bags for what looked like a vacation or something. So I think they're getting along just fine without me." Prue nodded, placated, though she sensed that her friend was not entirely convinced of his own story. "Think you'll ever tell them?" "I don't know," replied Curtis. "Maybe someday. It's complicated. I wouldn't want them to try coming in here to find me. They'd get lost in the periphery." "Though you're a half-breed," suggested Prue as she stepped off the rope bridge and followed Curtis down another wood plank staircase. "Like me. Wouldn't that mean that your parents can cross over?" "Who knows where that blood comes from?" said Curtis. "Maybe one has it, not the other." He thought for a moment. "I suppose my sisters are probably half-breeds, huh?" They arrived at the end of the staircase. Another wooden promontory stretched out into the chasm. A wire looped around the top of a tall post disappeared into the blankness before them. A flickering campfire could be seen in the distance. Curtis put his fingers to his lips and gave a shrill whistle. Within moments, a noise could be heard, the sound of something sliding along metal. A wooden cross, fixed with copper wire to a pulley assembly, came down the zip line and loudly thunked against the pole. Curtis grabbed it. "You want to go first?" he asked. "Okay," Prue said with some trepidation. She positioned her hands along the wooden handle. "Just hold tight," instructed Curtis. "You think?" said Prue, laughing. "Listen, I'm a natural-born bandit. Maybe I can teach you a thing or two." And with that, she lifted her feet from the ground and was carried at a breathtaking pace across the long gap. The wide rift's cool wind whisked up and bit at her face and hands. She could feel her face flush from the cold. Once the initial fear had fallen away, she found herself smiling so widely that her cheeks hurt. It seemed to Elsie that she'd barely closed her eyes, barely drifted into a half sleep, when an alarm bell rang loudly in the dormitory, followed by a renewed round of distorted barking from the loudspeaker. "Morning bell! Aerobic regimen! Commence!" Immediately, the room was filled with the complaining voices of sleepy girls and the cumulative rustle of 30 woolen blankets being thrown aside. Elsie followed suit. She noticed that not only had Rachel managed to ignore the command from the loudspeaker, but she'd also seemed to have slept through it. Elsie whispered loudly to her sister, "Rachel, wake up!" There was no response. A short, aged woman in a gray house dress entered through the double doors. Using a long wooden dowel, the woman pulled down a white screen that hung on the east wall. She then walked to the far side of the room and removed a shroud from a short pedestal, revealing an ancient-looking Super 8 projector. She turned it on, and a shivering ray of light fell on the screen, showing grainy black and white footage of a woman in a leotard. The film looked very, very old. As the figure in the film began to move, so did the girls in the dormitory, imitating the woman's every action. Elsie did likewise. The woman touched her toes, so did Elsie. The woman executed a series of jumping jacks, so did Elsie. The routine lasted about 10 minutes, with the wooden floor of the dormitory vibrating with every shift and jump of the room full of girls. Rachel managed to stay sleeping. Between activities, Elsie tried to wake her by kicking one of the legs of her sister's bed frame to no avail. Finally, the program came to an end and the projector shut off with a series of noisy clacks. The loudspeaker sparked afresh. "Bed 23!" No response. Elsie shuffled over to the bed and discreetly kicked the frame again. "Rachel!" she whispered. "Hmm?" answered Rachel, her face burrowed into the pillow. "Bed 23! Rise immediately!" Rachel's hand snaked out from beneath her thin blanket and began feeling around the side of the bed, presumably for the non-existent alarm clock. "Mom," she said, 10 more minutes." This elicited a series of giggles from the surrounding girls. "Miss Talbot!" squawked the loudspeaker. The gray-haired woman who'd been manning the projector tottered over to bed 23 and, taking a deep breath, lifted the metal bed frame, spilling Rachel's dormant body onto the hard wood of the floor. Rachel scrambled to her feet, trying to reorient herself to her bizarre reality. The girls around her had ceased their giggling and were looking at their feet. "Morning repast, 0700 hours. Then all work crews report to machine shop." An army of compliant souls. The girls in the dormitory began slipping their grease-marked gray coveralls over their woolen long johns. Some spoke in hushed tones to their neighbors. Others prepared for their day in silence. Rachel and Elsie watched in awe, unmoving, until Martha kicked at Elsie's footied foot. "Get your work clothes on," she hissed. "What, these?" asked Elsie, pointing to the coveralls she'd been given the night before. They were still shrouded in their plastic wrapping. Martha rolled her eyes. "Yes," she said, before adding, "Do I have to hold your hand through all this?" An older girl, sitting on the bed next to Martha's, spoke up out of the side of her mouth as she carefully laced a pair of black steel-toe boots. "Been awfully charitable with the noobs, eh, Martha?" I am a gracious person, said Martha snidely. Are we supposed to go to work too? Elsie asked. The girls in the booths stifled a laugh. Martha, yes, you're supposed to work. We're all supposed to work. Elsie cast her eyes around the room, perplexed. But I've never really worked before. I mean, I help out with chores around the house and stuff, but I've never been to, a job. Well, welcome to the working week, said Martha. Rachel, still half asleep, was taking this all in wordlessly. Hey, Goggles, she said finally. Martha gave her a look. I don't know who's told you what, but we're only here for a couple weeks. We're not officially orphans. Here she made air quotes with her fingers. So I don't think we're going to be doing any work, thanks very much, especially not in a machine shop. That's what they all say. This came from the girl next to Martha, who'd just finished stringing the last eye of her boot. That's what who say? That's what who say? Asked Rachel. Newbies, noobs, newcomers, they're all alike. I'm not going to work. My parents are coming back for me any day. Or, I might get adopted today. I'm not going to muck around in some machine shop. It's all the same. You'll break. Trust me, you'll break. The girl's voice seemed to have been long hollowed out, like a dead log. Or what? Challenged Rachel. What if I refuse? There's laws against this stuff. Martha chimed in. You'll get a demerit. Rachel laughed. Oh no, a demerit? She held the back of her hand to her forehead, feigning horror. What'll I do then? What's a demerit? Whispered Elsie. Martha ignored the younger sister, focusing her increasing annoyance on Rachel. Well, if you chalk up enough of them and then you're unadoptable. What? Asked Rachel, her hand falling from her face. Unadoptable, like you, and no adoption, answered the girl. But what does that even mean? I'm not an orphan. I'm not even up for adoption. Rachel had abandoned her snarky tone and was instead beginning to sound genuinely upset. Everyone is an orphan here, said Martha. It's not like anyone ever comes for us, but if you're unadoptable, then you're sent to the mister's study, and then we never see you again. Elsie stammered. Really? Never? Never, said Martha. Rachel, still shaking the sleep from her head, looked back and forth between the two younger girls. That's ridiculous, she said. They can't do that. We're just boarding here. Mom and Dad are coming back in 2 weeks. You said they weren't, Rach, before, offered Elsie. Rachel shot her sister a glare. I was joking. That's not for real. Of course they're coming back. Martha began slipping into her gray coveralls. She wiped some grease from the lens of her goggles and slid them over her hair. Hey, then you're fine, she said, sounding indifferent to the sister's plight. Just don't rack up any demerits. Rachel's temper was growing. Her face was turning the shade of a ripe, late summer tomato. Elsie had seen this happen before. A similar hue had risen to her sister's cheeks in the wake of her mother sneaking into her room to throw away all of her black lipstick. Elsie cradled Tina close to her chest, as if protecting her from the inevitable explosion. They can't do this, said Rachel, enunciating every word, each one louder than the last, until she capped the phrase at the top of her lungs with, "We're Americans!" With that final declaration, she marched toward the front of the room. Her red woolens were a size too big, and she had to hike up the leggings as she walked. Positioning herself below the loudspeaker, she addressed the disembodied voice angrily. "Hello?" she called. "I'm a, temporary resident here. My sister and me, we don't belong to the orphanage, and we're not going to be working in any machine shop." No response. And for the record, I don't think kids are being treated properly here. I don't think it's legal to make kids work in a factory. I'm pretty sure. Still silence. This is not fair. I'd like to get a phone call or something. A pair of girls could be heard whispering discreetly in the back of the dormitory. Okay, then, Rachel said, stepping up, her air of defiance. How about this? I refuse to work at your stupid machine shop. Then she stuck out her tongue and walked proudly back to her bed. Everyone in the room was watching her silently. Martha had frozen in place, her hands still on the goggles at her forehead. At a loss for what to say, Elsie pushed the button on intrepid Tina's back. A good day always starts with a balanced breakfast, said the doll helpfully. Before Rachel had reached her bed, the loudspeaker sputtered alive. She stopped abruptly at the noise. Bed 23, came the voice, and then 1 demerit. If a robotic voice could sound unfazed, it did so now. Everyone gasped at the loudspeaker's denunciation. Rachel's facial expression went from pride to shock back to anger in the span of a few seconds. Elsie witnessed them all. But before Rachel could turn and shout a retort, Elsie grabbed her by the arm. Please, Rach, she pleaded. Don't do anything. Just be quiet. Rachel stared at her sister's hand, her muscles twitching beneath the grip. Finally, like a dissipating cloud, the anger vanished from her face and her eyes retreated again beneath her bangs. Elsie could feel the muscles in her arm relax. She let go her grasp and looked at her sister squarely. Just 2 weeks, remember? Asked Elsie. Just let's hold on. Okay, Else, Rachel said. Okay. She slumped down on her bed, defeated. It was minutes before the aura of drama had dissipated from the dormitory. Elsie felt everyone's eyes on her and her sister as they both obediently slipped into the gray coveralls. Miss Talbot was on hand to receive the clothes they'd worn on arrival, which they would be allowed to have back during adoptee visits, though there was no indication that these visits would actually occur. The Melbergs then fell in line with the rest of the girls and made the slow march down to the cafeteria, where a meal of soggy pancakes and watery orange juice awaited them. They were soon joined by the other dorm. A dour gang of gray coverall-clad boys poured into the cafeteria and silently tucked into their breakfasts. Elsie and Rachel sat apart from the rest of the kids, across the laminate top of a long table, by no choice of their own. No one deigned to sit near them. Rachel picked at her food. She barely had 2 bites before she set her fork down resignedly. The spark Elsie'd seen in the dormitory was long vanquished. Back was the Rachel she knew from before, maudlin and silent. Once they'd finished and had deposited their metal trays in a dirty bus tub, a barked instruction from another loudspeaker in the cafeteria had the collected kids line up against one wall. From there, they marched single file out the door and down a wide staircase. Elsie could hear a hissing noise in regular intervals, somewhere off in the distance. The stairway led to another long hallway, and the line of workers followed it, their syncopated boot falls echoing along the walls, before finally arriving at a tall set of double doors. They must have been triggered automatically because as soon as the first in line had arrived at the doors, they swung open with a hydraulic wheeze, revealing a sight that made Elsie's stomach plummet. It was a large room, a very large room. In fact, Elsie couldn't remember seeing a building that could enclose such a large room when they'd first arrived at the orphanage. But it did exist, beyond doubt, and it was filled to the brim with what could only be described as contraptions. Small contraptions, big contraptions, copper and bronze contraptions, wooden contraptions, contraptions that spit steam from bugle-like orifices, contraptions that belched smoke and fire, kettle-looking contraptions with dials and gauges dotting their sides, square boxy contraptions with tentacles of iron and copper piping sprouting from their sides, spinning contraptions, static contraptions, contraptions that whistled, contraptions that farted, and all of them interlinked with a mesh of multicolored wire and electrical cable that gave the giant room the distinct aura of a dissected television set, like the one Elsie's father had let Curtis dismantle in his bedroom, and which, once its myriad screws had been unscrewed, revealed an entire Byzantine cosmos of unknowable circuits and wires. Oddly enough, the room smelled of raspberries. A long conveyor belt snaked around the room's many machines, and it was along this belt that most of the kids assembled, wiping their hands in preparation for the day's labor. Joffrey Unthank stood in the center of the room, cast in the light of a few caged bulbs hanging from the vaulted ceiling. He held a mug in his hand and sipped at it absently as the kids took their places along the conveyor belt. When Elsie and Rachel arrived in the room, he approached them. "I understand you're the new ones?" he asked the Melbergs. Before Elsie could respond, Rachel stepped forward protectively. "Yeah," she said. "You're the owner, huh?" He sipped at his mug before answering, "Joffrey Unthank, Mr. Unthank to you, owner and chief operator." "Well, this is illegal, I think," said Rachel. "You'd be surprised, my dear," said Joffrey. "I'd like to make a phone call," said Rachel. "Not with a demerit on your record," said Geoffrey. "Would you like another?" Elsie jabbed her sister with her elbow. Seeing Rachel retreat, Joffrey spoke. "Hands, please." "What?" asked Rachel. "Can I see your hands, please?" Dutifully, Rachel held out her hands. Joffrey inspected them. "Conveyor belt, third station." He pointed to a section of the belt over which hung a wooden sign marked with the Roman numeral 3. "Your neighbors will get you up to speed." Rachel gave Elsie a withering look and slouched away. Joffrey turned to Elsie. "Hands, please," he asked. Elsie did as she was told. Her hands felt empty without Entrepentina, whom she'd left safely stowed in the lockbox at the foot of her bed. Joffrey's eyes widened. "Beautiful!" he exclaimed. Setting the mug down, he began inspecting Elsie's hands. "So small!" he breathed. He looked at Elsie. "My dear," he said, "you are the proud owner of hands that were positively meant for machine parts. I haven't seen hands like these in years." Elsie, despite herself, murmured, "Thanks." Joffrey put his arm around her shoulder and walked her over to one of the contraptions, a glossy aluminum barrel-like object set on its side with a series of red and blue plastic tubes leading from it. There were 3 gauges on the front of the machine, one labeled ACK, another labeled UZ, and another with a glyph that looked to Elsie like an upside-down ice cream cone. "This, little baby," Joffrey said, patting the side of the machine, "is the Rhomboid Burnishing Oscillator 2.0. RBO for short." "What does it do?" asked Elsie. "Why, it oscillates and burnishes. It burnishes while it oscillates. The rhomboid bit is anyone's guess." Elsie didn't know what oscillate meant, but she didn't say anything. "Now," said Joffrey, "the operation of this machine is fairly simple. A huge improvement over the 1.5, let me tell you. You hit this button here, wait 10 seconds, and then pull this level here, and then you'll hear a little clanking noise." Joffrey walked her through the various steps. A clanking noise, followed by a gentle spinning sound, came from the machine. "Once you hear that, you just open this panel here, and voila!" Inside the machine, just beyond a little door in the chassis, Elsie could see a small octagonal metal nut, like the one you would see threaded onto a very small bolt. "Grab it, please, and quickly," he instructed Elsie. Doing as she was told, she slipped her hand into the small opening, grabbed the nut, and handed it to Unthank. Holding it between his thumb and forefinger, he continued, "Very good. This here is a high alloy rhomboid oscillated bolt nut. There's one in every automated daiquiri machine. Now, for all the manufacturer's improvements over the previous iteration of this machine, the way I see it, it's not enough. So I've taken it upon myself to do some tinkering of my own. Cherried the thing up, so to speak. Needless to say, it voided the warranty." The machine made a loud noise as a set of what looked to be metallic teeth chomped down on the space where the nut had been. Joffrey smiled. Elsie stared at him. He cleared his throat and continued, "Thing is, in order to maximize the efficiency of the machine, I've had to lose some of the, how would you put it, safety measures in place. So instead of the machine just spitting out a new nut into this tray, someone with really small hands has to remove the piece manually, like you just did." "Okay," said Elsie. "I see, I guess. Now, one thing you should know." He paused here and looked at her, a blank look on his face. "Sorry, what was your name?" "Elsie." "Lovely name. One thing you should know, Elsie dear, is that if your precious little fingers happen to be inside the machine when it recalibrates the dispenser, the greater machine parts community will be deprived of one of a pair of the greatest set of hands to come along in a generation." "What?" asked Elsie, trying to ferret out the meaning of the man's last phrase. "Or a couple of years, anyway. Beautiful. Tiny hands. Top 10, for sure." "It'll cut off my hand?" she gasped. Again, Joffrey cleared his throat. "Yes," smiled, "but you've got easily 5-6 seconds to get in there and grab the nut before it comes down. A girl with your gifts, you should be in and out of there in 2, maybe 3. Elsie was still imagining the consequence of delayed action. At the moment, she became acutely aware of how much she valued the fact that she had 2 hands. She tried to imagine life without one of them. She saw herself in some future kitchen trying to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with a hook for a hand. Even in her imagination, it was no simple task. Joffrey snapped his fingers. "Stay with me, Elsie dear. The other thing you should know is that these nuts are also so very valuable. So very, very valuable that if one should be destroyed, and trust me, the machine will destroy it if it gets stuck and it is not removed before the assembly continues, we, the factory, the orphanage, the greater community, are left with a world where there is one less high alloy rhomboid oscillated bolt nut in existence, and, by extension, one less satisfied automatic daiquiri machine owner. And that is bad, very bad. Is that clear?" "Yes, Mr. Unthank," said Elsie. "And so I'm sorry to say that if you do happen to let one be destroyed and do not retrieve it with these world-class machine part hands before the assembly continues, I'll be forced, by no fault of my own, to give you a demerit." A spike of fear ran through Elsie's chest. "Yes, Mr. Unthank," she said. "And you know what happens if you get 3 demerits, don't you?" "You're unadoptable?" "Exactly," said Joffrey, beaming a little. "You learn fast, Elsie. I think you're a very astute girl. And very astute girls often prove to have very long and happy career in machine parts." "Thank you, sir. Mr. Unthank, sir." "Well, then, I'm going to turn this little baby over to you. Remember, press button, wait around, pull lever, cranking sound. Yeah?" He repeated, stressing the rhythmic pattern of the rhyme. "Press button, wait around, pull lever, cranking sound." He walked away from Elsie, repeating the mantra in a sing-song voice, his fingers bobbing as if he were conducting an orchestra. Arriving in the center of the room, he surveyed the morning's production. The machines were all going full steam, creating a symphony of metallic clanks, buzzes, and moans. The kids were hard at work, some attending to the controls of machines like Elsie's, while others, like Rachel, were picking over minuscule bolts, nuts, and cogs on the long conveyor belt. "Music to my ears, children," called Mr. Unthink. "Music to my ears. Remember, machine parts make what? Machines," the kids called back in unison. "And machines make convenience. And what does convenience make? Freedom. And freedom makes, help me here, children, on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Families," finished the kids, with Joffrey joining them. "That's right, families," he said. "Now, if any of you need anything, I'll be right up there." He pointed to a wide window looking onto the factory floor, "keeping an eye on my little busybodies. Ta-ta!" He then exited the room, sweeping his coffee mug along in a deft gesture. Elsie turned to the RB02. The twin gauges, Ack and Uz, seemed to be 2 eyes glaring at her. Repeating the rhyme that Unthink had taught her, she began operating the machine. Within a few simple processes, the little clank could be heard, and a tinsel-bright nut dropped into the small inner chamber. Elsie's heart leapt into her throat, and she shot her hand into the hole, removing the nut just before the machine's teeth descended onto the space where her fingers had been. She whispered a benediction of thanks before placing the nut onto the conveyor that led away from the RBO. Elsa saw that Martha was manning the neighboring machine, her goggles covering her eyes as she pulled what looked like a fluorescent lamp on an articulated arm over the newly made nut. She saw that Elsie was looking at her and waved. "Keep it comin'," she shouted over the factory's din. She flashed Elsie a thumbs up and returned to her work. Elsie did likewise, pressing the red button in the middle of her machine, eliciting yet another ringing clank from the belly of the metal thing.